There is an elusive phenomenon that is plaguing countless people throughout this planet. Frequently appearing in bedrooms, in corners, or in hallways, these shadowy figures often observe without any contact, or in some cases, they can intrude upon an unsuspecting experiencer with brute force. A disturbing reality, to be sure, these entities, called by many shadow people, have strikingly similar characteristics. I first spoke with paranormal researcher Rosemary Ellen Guiley about the shadow person phenomenon just last year, but after having listened to multiple accounts from people in my own travels, it's clear that this is a subject that is worthy of revisiting. Listen now to Rosemary's overview of the shadow person enigma and how she has tied this omnipresent invader to what have been referred to as the Djinn. Rosemary, I so want to thank you for joining me once again to discuss a phenomenon that continues to pique my interest, and that's the shadow person phenomenon. I hadn't necessarily planned to cover this issue so soon after our last interview, although I think it's been about a year since we covered the subject. But I have to tell you, since that show we did, I have run into so many people who are admitting that they too are experiencers of this elusive phenomenon, these bedroom visitors. In fact, if you recall, the last time we spoke, we were talking about the case of Kelly. Kelly is not her real name, but this is a story that was told to me in specific and in intricate detail about how she had been having shadow person visits for years. Well, Rosemary, lo and behold, I happened to be talking to her mother months later. I don't really even remember how it came up, but lo and behold, her mother, in fact, admitted to me that she too has these bedroom visitors. And the interesting thing is that neither the mother nor Kelly knew that the other was having the experience. So I said, okay, what's going on here? We need to relook at this. Now, just a few weeks ago, yet another story. I'd met a woman while on vacation who knew of my work as a metaphysical writer. So she began discussing some of the subjects I cover, including this phenomena. Lo and behold, she too has been visited by shadow people for years. So it's clear that this is truly a common phenomenon, certainly more than I had initially expected. So I wanted to revisit the subject. But this time I thought we'd discuss an interesting correlation that you have made between shadow people and what are called the Djinn. So maybe we could start with that, Rosemary, with a little background on what or who the Djinn are.
The Djinn are a supernatural race of beings who share the planet with us. They were here before us, and they now are in a parallel dimension. They have various origin stories that are quite similar to fairy stories that we find in Celtic lore and other fairy lore around the world about the original occupants of the planet. And that when human beings came onto the scene, there are various explanations given as to why the original occupants get pushed out. They get displaced, and so they retreat further and further away until they're literally out of the physical world and into a parallel dimension. Mm-hmm. But they still have access to this world. And these stories are quite common around the world. They go back to ancient times, and they really do explain why we have the encounters that we do with otherworldly beings. They're not from another planet. They're not from outer space. They're not even from the astral realm, so to speak. They're literally from a dimension that is connected to planet Earth. These beings range in temperament from friendly to unfriendly and even malevolent. And some of them really don't do much with human beings. Some of them are kind of helpful. And others are just nasty. They're tricky, mischievous. They like to play pranks. Some of them even like to harm people, and as well as animals and other things that are important to people. These stories are consistent throughout the ages around the planet. Mm-hmm. And one of the most significant of these entities are the Djinn. And we don't know much about them in our culture. They just really never made it into our folklore. Doesn't mean they're not here, because all of these entities are everywhere. It's just that we haven't known very much about them. So about 10 years ago, I started studying shadow people, and one thing led to another. You know, you follow the tracks of the evidence. And several years ago, it became quite clear to me that shadow people really are a form taken by Djinn. And these would be Djinn who would be not very kindly disposed toward people. And they show up in these horrific forms, these dark, shadowy forms. They look very threatening and menacing. They sort of radiate this malevolent energy. They're solid black. They look like intruders, like a guy in a trench coat and a hat with no face suddenly made it to your bedside. And that's often what people think when they're startled awake by these beings. But sometimes, almost as soon as they're seen, they disappear. Some of them do follow families. You mentioned the mother and daughter. And this is what I find. I'm going on more than 10 years now documenting this phenomenon. And when people learn about it, they're often astonished that other people have had nearly identical experiences to theirs. Many people feel isolated, like it must be their imagination or something very peculiar about the place. They don't realize how widespread this phenomenon is. And if they haven't talked about it within their family, they're often shocked to discover that, yes, other members of their families experience the same thing. So that's kind of it in a nutshell there.
Yeah, well, I know there are lots of dimensions to this story, but, you talk about some of the characteristics of what you believe to be synonymous with shadow people, and that being the Djinn, but certainly one of the more unsettling characteristics is the malevolent intruder. So I wanted to read a section in your great book, The Djinn Connection, where you make a correlation between the Djinn and shadow people. I want to read a little passage and maybe have you elaborate on this a little bit. You say, of all documented encounters with unknown beings, shadow people stand out for the sheer panic and terror they cause to their human victims. These menacing black forms invade bedrooms where they stand and watch sleeping people, loom over them, crush them with suffocating weight, and sometimes physically attack them with vicious force. They come and go at will, unpredictably, materializing out of thin air, walking through walls, emerging from closets, and sliding out from under beds. Many of them emanate such intense malevolence and evil that victims often assume they are demons. They have a strong connection to abducting aliens or ETs. Although shadow people are not demons, nor are they ETs, however, shadow people are Djinn. Our encounters with them are more common than any other entity except perhaps ghosts. There's a lot said there, but the part that stood out for me, Rosemary, is the fact that this is creepy. I mean, this, and it's this is something that could really turn someone's life upside down. What from the stories that you've received, what percentage would you say are truly malevolent encounters versus just observational encounters?
Most of the ones I hear about are border from the, I want to say benign because they're non-interactive. That is, the being does not act out against the people, to the malevolent. But even when the beings just stand there, like they're watching or observing, people are terrified because this thing seems threatening. It's huge. They're 6 feet tall and over. They radiate this malevolent energy, which is very purposeful. They want people to be afraid because we give off a lot of energy emotionally when we're terrified, and I think that these beings absorb that. They vampirize it in some way. So I would say the overwhelming majority of all shadow people experiences are scary and frightening. No one, to my knowledge, has ever been seriously injured by shadow people, although people say they have had bruises and marks and upon their body after having a scuffle with one. But it's the psychological terror involved. I would say for every horrific, I should put it this way. Every now and then I hear from people who say, oh, these beings are totally benign. In fact, I think they're benevolent. One comes and visits me, and I think it's a guardian kind of being. For every one of those I have hundreds at the complete opposite end of the scale. So by and large, I don't think these encounters have any goodwill behind them at all. The Djinn have a variety of ways of interacting with us. They're masterful shapeshifters, so they can take a lot of forms. They don't need to be shadow people all the time. And sometimes they do like to attach to people. Some of them even become infatuated or in love with people and want to become like a spirit companion, and even with a little spirit sex thrown in there. So they're not going to want to hurt someone that's giving them those kinds of benefits. But shadow people being guardians, in my opinion, it's highly unlikely. And if that's what somebody is feeling about a frequent visitor like this, then it's a masquerade for something else, so that person drops their guard and becomes more trusting. These beings basically are predatory in nature, and it's a widespread phenomenon. They can be documented for centuries.
Sure.
Now, they haven't always been called shadow people, but when we look back over, for example, the ghost lore, and we find dark entities, there is a crossover into the demonic world, phantom nuns, phantom monks, black ghosts, sliding around, figures that seem to lurk in sentinel-like positions and do a lot of watching. These could all be early versions of shadow people.
Yeah, it seems that there are a lot of intersecting criteria from what you're talking about, as well as what I've observed. You talk about I guess you'd call it a parasitic quality that perhaps these entities are looking to get from their victims or the experiencers, just based on parasiting from that sheer that energy that comes from sheer fear. And it reminds me of it doesn't remind me. You talk about every once in a while getting a story of someone who feels that they're benevolent or it doesn't necessarily bother them. The mother of Kelly, indeed. Now, I just want to say she happens to be 81 years old, Rosemary. She's I know her quite well. And again, I don't even recall how or why it came up, but she indeed told me. But here's what she said. She said, doesn't really bother me. It's in the condo that she's in right now, which I think she's been there for maybe, close to a decade. She lives there by herself, and she just said matter-of-factly, I'll wake up, something will wake me up, and I will indeed see what you have often described, shadowy figure, opaque, at the doorway, and she'll sometimes watch until it just fades, but she does not seem to be afraid, interestingly. She just accepts it.
Actually, that's a very good position to be in, because the minute you're afraid, that's when they have you. And it's hard for most people to not be afraid.
Of course.
For one thing, they're often startled by these things. And because they're dark and they seem to be malevolent, there's an immediate association with something demonic or horrific. And people are frightened. It's this primitive, instinctive, adrenaline kind of reaction. However, when for some people, when they are frequent victims with these visitations, some of them, everybody has different tolerance levels, and it also depends on the behavior of the things. They develop an immunity to it. It becomes predictable. And so they might not even like it very much, but it's like, oh yeah, there's that thing again. And it might be standing in a corner, standing in a doorway. Now, these beings, the Djinn, as well as other beings who drop into our physical reality, it seems like they use certain energies of place, as well as attachments to people. And not all of them are attached to people, but there may be limitations in terms of the way they can move around in physical space. It's like a trolley running on tracks, and as long as the electricity is there in the tracks, then the trolley can run, and anything off the tracks doesn't go. So some of these beings don't seem to do much else but appear in a doorway or a corner, and that's where they are, and they appear and then vanish. Others seem to have quite a bit of volatility and volition and mobility, and they're able to just motor all over the place. and they do so quite rapidly, which is also very startling and unfriendly.